Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, my name's Sean Dove, a motion designer from Melbourne, Australia, and today we're going to take a look at another Cinema 4D quick tip. Today I wanted to take a look at a super easy way we can create this fun selfie style reflection. I was inspired to have a go at this after being a long-time fan of the incredible work by the artist known as Fan Akapan. If you don't know who he is, his Instagram bio reads, "the pioneer of balloon graph," and I think that sums his work up just perfectly. Not only is his stuff wildly creative, but his ability to capture reflections is just mind-blowing. And this is all done by hand. That's just insane. So of course I was inspired to see what sort of results we could get using Cinema 4D. Now before I started, I figured I was gonna need some sort of reflective ball. Now unfortunately I didn't have a VFX chrome ball handy, but what I did have was this bad boy, the humble Christmas bauble. Now it's not perfect, the surface is a little rough, but I thought it just might be able to do the trick. Next we ran outside and I snapped this guy just using my iPhone, trying to get as close as possible, maximizing that resolution because we're gonna be using this photo for our reflections. All right, with that already, let's jump in, we'll go have a play. Welcome back guys, thanks for joining us. Sorry if I'm sounding a bit nasally, the hay fever at the moment is absolutely killing me, but let's get into it. Now to start with, I've loaded up my image that we're going to be using to capture our reflections in Photoshop. And what we're needing to do here is create a square crop around our bauble. Now a nice way to start, we can come over here and pull in some guides from our ruler. And this is just going to help us get a nice square crop on our bauble. Nice, that's close enough. I'm going to hit M for my marquee tool. And while holding shift, I'm going to create a nice perfect square selection. I'll just nudge that down one. Nice, I'm happy with that. Then we can hit C on our keyboard, enter twice, and nice. We've now got a perfect crop on our bauble. I feel like we can just zoom in a little bit to our edges, and we probably could have got a little bit closer. We probably could have got a little bit closer. If we just hit C to bring up our crop tool, I'm just holding Shift and Alt at the same time, and we can bring this in uniformly. And I'll hit Enter to commit. Nice, I'm happy with that. All right, now what we want to do is come up to Filter, down to Distort, and select Polar Coordinates. Now by default, it's probably going to have this rectangular to polar selected for you, but what we're actually going to do is the opposite, polar to rectangle. And as you can see in our little preview, it's unwrapped our sphere for us to stretch into our square crop. Hitting OK to commit, and beautiful, there we go. I'm just going to double click on our background layer. We can even rename this Bauble Unwrap. And then what we're going to need to do is double the width of our canvas. So let's come up to Image, Canvas Size. What we're going to need to do here is double our width. So I'm going to times this by 2, hitting OK. And nice. Nice. Now what we need to do is stretch our image to fit. So by pressing Command T on our keyboard, we bring up our transform tool. And I'm going to hold down Alt and Shift at the same time and just stretch it until we snap to the edge of our canvas. Looks like we might be a pixel off on this side. No, looking good. Hitting Enter to commit. Beautiful, look at that. Gonna hide our guides for a second. And there we go. We've now got our unwrapped bauble image ready to go. Now, lastly, what I'm going to do is come up to Image, Mode, and just change this to a 32-bit channel. And this is going to allow us to save this as a HDR file. And it might just allow us to get a little bit more light information out of this image. So now we can save this. And rather than a Photoshop file, let's change it to a Radiance file. And this will only be available if you did change it to be a 32-bit image. Now, of course, saving this as a JPEG or something like that will do a fine job as well. Nice, so now that we've got that, let's go jump into Cinema. Now to have a bit of a play testing out the reflections of that image, I thought using my little piece model here would be a great example. We're gonna get some nice reflections, hopefully, in those folds. So before we bring our image in, let's throw a sphere into our scene. I'm just going to reset its PSR to be exactly where our little piece to be exactly where our peace hands are. Now what I want is for this sphere to capture our entire model. So hitting T for scale, I'm just going to start scaling this up. What we can even do is on our sphere, come over to the basic tab and just enable X-ray mode. And this is going to allow us to see through it. And now we can position it a bit easier. Nice, something like that. Something like that's not a bad start. We're actually poking through it a little bit on our finger here. So let's just scale it up a little bit more so it's entirely captured. Great, I'm happy with that. Now the scale of our sphere will change how the reflection appears in our models. With this really tight environment we've now created around our model, we should get some really fun reflections. All right, so let's create a new material. I'm going to disable the color and the reflectance and just worry about the luminance. So with that enabled now, let's load in that texture we just created. Great, so now that we've got that, we can close down our window. And I'm going to drop this onto our sphere. I'm also going to disable X-ray mode now that we're happy with the scale and position of it. But what I am going to do is hit R to bring up our rotate tool and just rotate this 90 degrees counterclockwise there to straighten it up. And as you can see, the backside, we're not going to get the backside of our bauble here. So we're going to get this really crazy pinching. But what we want to do is focus on the other side. And here we can see we've now essentially created our bauble inside Cinema. So now we can rotate this around. And what we're essentially doing now is we're going to try and find a position that is going to capture nice reflections. Now, if I hit render right now and I've just got the default settings on, we're not going to see our model. We're not going to see our model, and that's because our sphere, of course, is blocking that. So what we can do is come up to tags, Cinema 4D tags, and let's throw on a compositing tag. And what I'm going to do is say, you're not seen by camera, and you don't cast or receive shadows. Let's hit render again. Great, now straight away, we're no longer seeing our sphere. So now what we can do is create a texture to replace our basic white material here to get some nice reflections. So let's again, in our material editor, create a new material. And in the reflectance tab, let's add a Beckman. I'm going to turn our roughness right down. I'm just going to go 2%. What we're wanting to do here is try and get as close to this reflection happening in our model. So I'm going to replace that white material. I'll just hide our sphere for a second as well. And there we go. We've got our reflective material has nicely replaced that base white mesh we had. I'm just going to hit render again for a second. Apologies, let me re-enable our sphere. There we go, hitting render. And straight away, we're now capturing our image in our model. Now, because the bauble has all those imperfections, when we get such a perfect reflection like this with such little roughness, we're going to get all those imperfections. And although that could be a bit of a cool look, because it's a bit low quality, it makes our reflection also look low quality. So a fun way to sort of get around this is we're going to enable the bump channel in our reflective material. Let's come up to texture. Let's throw in a noise. And just using the base noise, let's pull its scale down to 4%. We've got a really tiny noise. Our strength as well, let's pull that down to 2%. Again, this isn't a huge amount of noise, but what this is going to allow it to do is just break up that reflection a little bit. And even though we're distorting it further, it now makes that reflection almost look higher quality. And this is just using the default settings inside Cinema, and look at those reflections. This is already looking pretty cool. Now what you really want to do is play around with your sphere and find that perfect spot for yourself that you're able to capture your own reflection. So I'm actually going to delete this sphere for a second. And in this scene that I've already got set up, I'm going to re-enable our other sphere. And this is just because I've already found that angle that I was quite happy with. And as you can see, this is more or less that same scale that we just set that previous sphere to. And this already has that compositing tag. So now when I hit render, So now when I hit render, we're now capturing that reflection again in our balloon model. And that little bit of noise is just distorting that reflection a bit. It makes the balloon feel like it's got those imperfections rather than the reflection itself. So I've been getting a few questions about render settings. Now, I certainly don't feel like an expert when it comes to this sort of stuff, but I thought let's break down the settings that I typically use, particularly for a still image. So first up, let's jump over into the physical renderer. Two things that I'm going to enable straight away in our effects window is ambient occlusion. And the only real thing I end up playing with here is this maximum ray length. Typically, I'll increase it to something around 600 just to push those contact shadows that little bit further. Next, for something like this, let's throw in some global illumination. Now, in both cases with the primary and secondary method, I tend to use this QMC. And with the samples, I enable a custom sample count and I bust this up to 100. And typically, as always, the higher your sample count, the better quality your render is going to be, but of course, you're going to take a hit in actual render time. Now, lastly, let's jump into our physical tab. And rather than adaptive for the sampler, I'm going to throw it into fixed. And then let's add a custom quality and throw our sample subdivisions up to 4. And what this number is here is the amount of sample subdivisions you're going to get per pixel in your render. Now I've got these 4 settings to play with down here within the physical tab. We've got our blurriness subdivision, the shadow subdivision, ambient occlusion subdivision, and the subsurface scatter subdivision. And in each case, this number corresponds with the amount of quality you're going to get in each of those cases. So the blurriness, focusing on that blur, particularly if you've got reflective or transparent objects. The shadow subdivision count looks at the quality of your shadows and the exact same with your ambient occlusion. For what I like to do to get a nice clean render, I'll throw 5 into our blur. For our shadows, I typically bump it up to about 3. And then with that ambient occlusion, I'll throw that to 4. And then our subsurface scatter, let's even bump that up to 3. I'll hit render right now. As you can see, we're going to get a nice clean image. We're actually getting quite a nice clean image, and we're not taking too much of a hit on that render. It's not the quickest, but whenever you're dealing with reflection or transparency, you do have to expect to take a bit of a hit. So this is coming through and it's looking pretty nice here. Now with anything, you're going to want to do a bit of post work on any render. So I want to render this out and take it back into Photoshop to do a few final touches. But before we do, one final thing I like to do, which is going to help us with that post compositing work in Photoshop, is come up to the object that we're playing with. Come over to tags, Cinema 4D tags, and again, let's throw on a compositing tag. And in here, all I'm going to do is enable an object buffer. And what this is going to allow us to do is render out a mask along with our image. Let's load back up our render settings. And under multipass, let's add an object buffer. Now the group ID, you want that to correspond with your object. You can have multiple object buffers within your scene. You would just need to enable a different number in the hierarchy. Let's enable the multipass in our render settings here. Come over to save, and let's give this a spot to save out. Saving it as a PSD will work great for us. And then let's come over to our render settings. Let's get a nice big 4K image. We're just going on a still, we're just going for a still image here. So let's bump it up. Let's get some nice high quality. Now in this case, we just had that black background. So let's throw our background into our scene. I got this blue text that I'm going to throw into our background here. We'll send this to the picture viewer. And when that's done, we'll jump over into Photoshop. So one last thing, let's pull up our render settings here. Now that we've sort of dialed this in, where we know this is going to be our nice clean render. So let's come down to render settings. I'm going to save this as a preset. So this is going to be our clean preset. So now all you need to do is come down to your render settings, load preset, and you can pull that in, and that's going to save everything that we've just set. These sample subdivisions is essentially the higher the count, the more quality you're going to get in each of these particular areas. But of course, the higher the count, the more of a hit you're going to take with the actual render. So this is going to be our clean preset, but let's also create a bit of a fast one. I'm just going to copy and paste this clean preset. This is going to be our fast preset. And all I would really do here is start to pull down our subdivisions. So in our sampler, let's pull that down to 1 or 2. Let's maybe go 2. And same with each of these. Let's pretty much halve them. So I'm gonna go 2, 1, 2, 1. Our ambient occlusion and the global illumination, we can more or less leave alone. It's these physical settings that are really gonna be the ones going a long way to change how our render comes out. Now, of course, this is gonna be quicker, but it is gonna be noisier as well. So let's hit render. Now in this case, we're actually not doing too bad of a job because we've got such a reflective material and we're not really casting any shadows in our scene here. So, but you can see we spat that out in 10 seconds compared to that render that, what did that end up taking? 4 minutes for that cleaner finish. Now, of course, this is a nice big 4K render and I'm pretty happy with how it's come out. Now, of course, once we take this over into Photoshop, we're gonna be able to push it that a little bit further. I really want to pull out some of these highlights, particularly in the top here. And I reckon it's just looking a little bit muddy in the front. So we'll try and flatten out some of this contrast. All right, so now that we've got this ready, let's take it over into Photoshop and get going. All right, so let's load this guy into Photoshop. I'm going to double click on our layer so we can rename it. And this is our reflection piece render. Now let's jump over into the channels. And what you're going to see here, this is where that object buffer is going to render out to. So just by clicking on that layer, we're going to solo it out. Then we're going to hit Command A to select our entire artboard and then Command C to copy. Great, so let's jump back over into our layers. And with our render selected, let's throw on a mask. Now in that mask, I'm gonna hold down Alt and click in it. And this is gonna allow us to jump into that mask layer. Then we can hit Command V to paste that object buffer render. And great, now straight away we've got our piece hand isolated instantly. I'm gonna disable our mask for a second. And what I'm going to do is recreate this little gradient in the background here. So I'm going to eyedrop both corners, hit G to bring up our gradient tool, and then just do a linear gradient corner to corner on a new layer. We can then drop this beneath our render. We can then drop this beneath our render and re-enable that mask. Great, so now we've got that background isolated and our piece hand right on top. So like I said, I like to push this a little bit further. And one thing I reckon we can particularly do is pull back on some of the darkness we're seeing from the ground. I want to flatten out some of this reflection a little bit. So I'm going to drop our levels into our scene and then find that sweet spot between each layer and hit Alt to make sure this levels is just going to isolate on our piece hands here. So what I'm trying to do now is just lift some of those shadows that we're seeing, particularly from the ground there. But now that's really blown out the top area. So let's jump into the mask of that layer. And with a really soft brush and a black in our foreground, let's just start painting out the top of our hand here. Nice, that's going to bring back some of that color and just make sure we're not blowing out those highlights too much. Now, speaking of bringing back the color, I reckon we could actually push this back a little bit. That blue is actually feeling a little bit too punchy for me now. So let's grab our hue and saturation, drop this so it's also going to be isolated on just our layer in the saturation. I'm going to pull that back a little bit. Now again, I only wanted this to pull back on some of that blue, not particularly in the foreground here. So let's select the mask of our hue and saturation, and again with black and a nice soft brush, let's just paint some of it away from the foreground. All right, I'm going to grab another levels. Before we go any further, let's just rename some of our layers here. Let's tidy this up a little bit. So we've got our layers base, our saturation for the top, and this level is also going to be for the top. So let's jump into the properties of this new levels. Now what I'm going to do is really push some of those highlights. Now what I want is for this to start to feel backlit. So I only really want this to start bleeding around some of the edges. So I can almost come through and start painting it out through the base and also some of the middle area there. Actually, let's grab another hue saturation. And for this, I just want to punch some of that color in my arm particularly. I'm looking a little bit sickly there. So let's, again, just in that master color, let's start pushing that forward. Nice, I'm looking a little bit warmer. That's what I like to see. Let's grab our soft brush again and just pull out some of that blue that, of course, is going to come back from the top of our fingers. And just like that, we've really pushed this render quite a bit from what we saw out of cinema. And you can see how quickly, with just 4 little layers, we're able to really give this render some life. And I thought this was a lot of fun, particularly with just using that Christmas bauble. I feel like this is something that everyone could have lying around, or at least you're able to get from the $2 shop pretty easy. So if anyone hasn't played doing this technique, please share anything you can create with us. I'd certainly love to see it. All right, thanks guys. Can you believe 2 videos in a year? This This is going pretty well. Let's see if we can keep this momentum going. All right, thanks for sticking around, guys. I'll see you again soon. Cheers.